Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Map Room. I'm your host, Eric Cunningham, and with us, as usual, we have Jared Stone and Nick Morris. This week, we're going over the state of Virginia, which has been a state that has been politically competitive in the past, but has gradually shifted into a point where we now consider it to be safe for the Democratic Party in both its presidential and Senate race. There's a reason that this state has become so politically leaning to the left at this point, even though as recently as 2019, it had a Republican legislature. So we're going to go right into things. I'm going to throw it to Jared Stone. He's going to kind of explain the recent presidential and Senate races that have gone on in Virginia.
Yeah, so first I'll share my screen. So as Eric mentioned, I'll go into the more specific results from the presidential and Senate races starting after the turn of the millennium, which is where we really start to see trends take hold of the state in a variety of ways throughout the various regions of the state. I'm first going to go into the 2000 presidential race, which was obviously having Texas Governor George Bush pitted against Tennessee Senator Al Gore. And this was a state that was expected to go into the Republican column very easily. Most news organizations had it rated as a safely Republican state at this time for the presidential election, and this is due to a few reasons. First of all, if you look at the southwest region of the state, you can see that there is some residual Democratic support. This had been a region that had voted for a lot of Democrats in the past few decades and had been very strong in having Democratic support here. In fact, up until 2011, a Democratic representative basically represented this region of Southwest Virginia that, as you can see, extends a little bit into the sort of the border of Kentucky. But George Bush even started to make some gains in this region. Even though there are not that many people who live in this region, he really started to make some significant inroads here. So that really helped him consolidate a helpful coalition that helped him win the state 2 times, as we'll see with the next election. The reason why he really won it is because of his performance in the urban and suburban areas. First, what I'm showing right here is the Richmond area. Richmond is the capital of Virginia. There are a few heavily conservative, traditionally conservative suburban areas that surround Richmond. One of them in particular is Chesterfield County, as I'm outlining right here. That'll be an important county of note when we're talking about more granular aspects of Virginia politics. You can also see over here on the southeastern corner of Virginia is the city of Virginia Beach, which has historically voted Republican. It has been close in recent elections, especially going to Obama in 2008, while Donald Trump won it very narrowly in 2016, as we will see. The reason why George Bush, however, won the state was particularly because of his performance in Northern Virginia. There are 3 predominant counties that comprise the Northern Virginia area as we see today. The anchor of it is really Fairfax County right over here. Fairfax County is a suburban county that is predominantly suburban that is right outside of Washington, D.C. You have a lot of business professionals. You have people who work in government, in interest groups, in other consulting firms in D.C., a lot of whom live in the Fairfax County area. And so this has been historically a very business-oriented, capitalistic, center-right economically area that has voted consistently for Republican candidates. Even Bob Dole was able to win Fairfax County in 1996. This was the last time, however, that Fairfax County voted for a Republican candidate on the presidential level, mainly because it is growing rapidly and becoming much more diverse. It is becoming a home of many more groups of minority individuals, many of whom lean to the left, as well as some of the white suburbans. In fact, a lot of the white suburbans who lived here are starting to lean more to the left socially, which is pushing them into the Democratic column. However, we can see here is that even notwithstanding that, Loudoun County right over here and Prince William County, which are other suburban counties, voted very strongly for George W. Bush. Going into 2004, George Bush won the state by a nearly identical margin of around 8%. But you can see a few changes. You can see some even more inroads from the Republican candidate into southwestern Virginia. And you can still see some of that traditional burgeoning strength of Republicans in the Richmond suburbs in Virginia Beach, in the central part of the state, in the sort of the Hampton Roads areas. You can even see some Republican strength there. But Fairfax County notably flipped. And as I was talking about, it is a county that has been moving rapidly to the left since 2000 for a variety of those reasons. For those reasons I mentioned, mainly the new minority influence, the suburban realignment, and the social stances that have taken it away from the Republican Party. However, Loudoun County and Prince William County still voted solidly for George W. Bush. And this, in sum, helped him get to a victory of around 8% in the state. Go to 2008, Barack Obama was able to flip the state from the Republican column into the Democratic column. One thing that's notable is that when Barack Obama had not reached the result of the primary yet, when he was still very much in the running, and Hillary Clinton had a possibility of winning the Democratic primary, there were multiple sources that contended that if Hillary Clinton was up against John McCain that year, John McCain actually would have won Virginia, which is very interesting because that would not be the case today. But you can see that Barack Obama was able to make significant gains in the DC suburbs, which were very rapidly growing. Loudoun County and Prince William County flipped. And you can see these little dots over here mark some of the independent cities that line the counties. You can also see some more rural areas shifting slightly towards Obama. You can see some college towns like Roanoke, or just small towns like Roanoke and Blacksburg, which is home to Virginia Tech, I believe, as well as Charlottesville, which is home to the University of Virginia, and just other areas of the state that were able to shift quite modestly or at least significantly towards Obama. Going to 2012, Mitt Romney was able to make a slight improvement in the state. However, he was not able to manage to win the state just because Obama was able to hold steady margins in places like Loudoun County, Prince William County, as well as Fairfax County. Even though Romney did make some modest gains in the rest of the state, particularly in the more rural areas and the Virginia Beach area, he was able to make gains above John McCain. Going to 2016, you really started to see those competing forces at play that helped Hillary Clinton win the state, but not by a huge margin. One thing that's notable is that Tim Kaine was her running mate. Tim Kaine is a native son of Virginia. He was governor of Virginia in the early 2000s, and that was expected to help Hillary Clinton win the state by a much more solid margin. But because those rural areas really fell through in favor of Donald Trump, he was able to win a fairly substantial amount of the vote in the state. However, the Nova area of the state, again, with Loudoun County, Prince William County, and Fairfax County, did swing heavily towards Hillary Clinton. A lot of those center-right, more centrist, socially liberal individuals who live in those areas felt very taken aback by Donald Trump's comments, especially in terms of immigrants and things of that nature. And they voted more strongly for Hillary Clinton than even Barack Obama, even as Donald Trump made gains throughout other parts of the state. So 2020, something that we'll talk about later, but in the meantime, I just want to quickly go over the Senate races that were a lot of times concurrent with the presidential races. In 2000, you had George Allen, a former governor of Virginia, win quite handily the state over Chuck Robb. You can see that even though he lost Fairfax County, he still had a significant amount of strength in the Northern Virginia area, even as Chuck Robb was able to have some pockets of support throughout other parts of the state, including Southwestern Virginia and some of the more Black Belt region, which we'll talk about a little bit later, I'm assuming, which is very much agrarian and reminiscent of other Black Belt areas throughout the South. So he won by around 5%. Going to 2006, George Allen and Jim Webb had a pretty contentious race. Now, 2006 was an optimal year for Democrats. They made gains. In fact, they flipped Congress that year. George Allen was a pretty viable contender. However, he made an insinuation regarding race, a pretty offensive comment that really put him down in the polls, and that helped buoy Jim Webb to a win in the state. You can still see that even though Jim Webb did make some gains in the Northern Virginia area, there was still substantial Republican support throughout other parts of the state. And so George Allen almost won the state, but he just narrowly missed. 2012, you had Tim Kaine, who was a senator at the time, who's running for the Senate. He also had a match against George Allen. He ended up winning this one very much off the back of Obama's strength in the state. And then 2018 with Tim Kaine, he won again against Corey Stewart, and he won by a massive margin. This is a bad year for Republicans in general in Virginia, as we'll go into more later. But he won by over 15% margin. Just absolutely gargantuan margins in Northern Virginia. The Richmond suburbs like Chesterfield, you can see, was flipped here, as well as those scattered college towns, even though Corey Stewart did decently well in some of the more rural areas, especially in Southwestern Virginia. Finally, going over to the other class of Senate elections, John Warner was a senator from Virginia, known as a pretty moderate Republican. He voted for quite a few Democratic policies during his tenure in Congress. And so he was generally very well liked. In fact, so much so that he didn't even garner a Democratic opponent in 2002. And he won this race by winning pretty much every county and city by around 83% of the vote against two pretty low recognition independents. Then going 2008, the opposite pretty much happened. Mark Warner went against Jim Gilmore, and Mark Warner, who had served in the state government until that point, he won by winning pretty much every county, bar just a few that are scattered throughout the state. What you can really see here, and that's quite notable, and this is a truism of Mark Warner specifically, is that he used to have significant strength in some of the more rural areas of Virginia that are now shifting towards the Republican Party. You can even see that some of these counties in southwestern Virginia gave him even stronger margins than a lot of the Nova counties, which is something very interesting. Finally, going to 2014, Mark Warner was expected to win this race quite handedly, even though conditions were good for Republicans at the time, but he won by less than 1%. This was quite a surprise. Ed Gillespie happened to be a pretty good candidate to rally around people in the suburbs. In fact, he was able to win back Loudoun County, as you can see right over here. But Mark Warner, I would say, really won because he was able to hold down those Republican gains in the more rural parts of the state, especially along the western border with West Virginia. If he had endured Trump-level results in this part of the state, he likely would have lost that race. And that would have created a pretty interesting alternate history timeline. Something that I'll just add tangentially is that Ed Gillespie ended up running in the 2017 gubernatorial race against Ralph Northam, and he was not able to mimic those very strong showings in the suburbs, especially in the Northern Virginia area. And so even though he was an optimal candidate for the suburbs at this time, that did not come to fruition in his 2017 bid for governor.
That's a great overview from Jared, kind of the presidential and Senate race history. So as you could tell, it was a pretty competitive state, Virginia, for most of the 2000s, even the 2010s. But the trend of Democrats winning has been pretty constant for a while, and there's been a lot of notable Republican failures, specifically at the statewide level. So I'm going to go ahead and start share my screen here to show you some of these races. So 2001 is the race where Mark Warner really started to take on. He ran very much a rural-focused campaign against a Republican candidate, Mark Earley, who did very well in the suburban counties and areas in the northern portion of Virginia. But as you can see, rural Virginia went pretty strongly for Warner, which gave him a pretty strong win. Now, in Virginia, governors cannot run for a second term. They can run after or they cannot run for re-election, rather. So they can run for a second term, but they have to wait 4 years. So even though Mark Warner was extremely popular, to the point where he was able to win in the landslide in the Senate race in 2008, he wasn't able to run in 2005. So Tim Kaine, another good year for Democrats in 2005, ran a pretty solid campaign, was able to win the state with around 52% of the vote. You'll see he held a lot of those rural areas pretty strongly and also made gains into places like Loudoun and Prince William County, which is how he was able to win the state pretty easily. 2009 was kind of the last grasp of Republican strength in Virginia, where they swept the statewide races. The big win was, of course, the gubernatorial race, where Bob McDonnell, a moderate Republican, or moderate to conservative Republican, rather, very typical of a Virginia Republican, just utterly dominated the state. You can see, not only did he win all of the counties in Northern Virginia, he won Loudoun, Prince William, and Fairfax even. He also won places like Charlottesville County. He won Chesterfield. He won Henrico County, which is another rapidly Democratic trending area. He even won a few black belt areas and did very strongly in the state overall. And so going into 2013, Republicans were fairly confident they would be able to hold the state, mainly because they had a credible nominee on the other hand on the Republican side. So if you go into the Republican primary here, the Republican convention, Lieutenant Governor Bill Bolling was the presumed nominee. Unfortunately for Republicans, Bill Bolling was not the nominee. Ken Cuccinelli, who was the Attorney General of Virginia, decided to run for governor as well. And they ultimately had a convention. He was the only candidate to run by deadline. He was formally nominated by the state convention. There were polls showing that Cuccinelli was far more popular and would be far more likely to win the Republican primary. So Bolling just decided to drop out entirely. This left Republicans with a really subpar candidate because although Cuccinelli was, won election fairly easily in 2009, he was way too conservative for the state. And even though this was a good year for Republicans, 2013 and 2014, they lost the race to Terry McAuliffe. You'll notice here it was a three-way race. Robert Sarvis, a libertarian, won about 6.5% of the vote, which came out of places like Chesterfield County, Loudoun, Prince William, even some rural counties. And so McAuliffe was able to win by a pretty decent 2.6 point margin. And this is a really big disappointment for Republicans that kind of set up their entire cycle. They had another notable recruiting failure in the lieutenant governor election, where they nominated a minister and conservative activist, E.W. Jackson, who was very, very conservative, far more than even Cuccinelli. And he was just, unfortunately for Republicans, unable to have any inroads. And Ralph Northam, a state senator, was able to win the state easily, decisively, by over 11 percentage points. By around 11 percentage points. This is a really bad showing by Republicans in general. It's an example of why candidate quality matters. Finally, to top things off was the attorney general election, which was extremely close. It was decided by under 1,000 votes. You can see here that even though Mark Abenshain, who was the Republican nominee, managed to lose places like Loudoun and Prince William, he still came very close to winning, although ultimately Mark Herring, the Democratic nominee, was victorious by a very small margin. So going into 2017, Republicans were hopeful they could reclaim things again. They had a credible nominee in Ed Gillespie, who was the Senate nominee, as explained earlier, in 2014. People took this race very seriously and the possibility of it flipping back to the Republican column very seriously. Unfortunately for Republicans, this was another failure. They lost the state by around 9%, losing even places like Chesterfield County, just performing very poorly overall, despite some strong rural strength by Gillespie and those more Trump-friendly rural areas in the western portion of the state. He lost pretty much everywhere else, and it was just a bad showing overall. The other levels were a little bit better for Republicans, specifically the lieutenant governor election. They only lost this one by about 5.5 percentage points. Jill Vogel didn't come close to winning, but she did hold places like Virginia Beach and Chesterfield. While on the attorney general side, Mark Herring, who ran for re-election, easily defeated John Adams, who is a descendant of that Adams family, the family of the founding father, John Adams, the long-standing line there. Unfortunately for them, they were not able to reclaim the seat. There is another election coming up in 2021, and Democrats are presumed the favorites here, although there's many other scenarios. There's lots of candidates running, some of them who could be better or worse for the Democratic Party overall. One other thing I want to show here is the kind of the last grasp of Republicans was the 2019 elections, where they were hoping to hold the state House and the state Senate. They held strong majorities in both chambers, or majorities rather, in both chambers. Despite losing the popular vote fairly consistently, judges redrew the maps in the middle of the decade, as it tended to happen, and going into the cycle, they were hopeful that they could at least hold on, have some leverage in redistricting, but even that kind of went away. So the state House districts, as you can see here, Democrats basically have lost their strength in the rural portions of the state, specifically in the West. Only places like Roanoke and Charlottesville went along with them, along with some Black Belt areas and Richmond areas. They were able to claim 5 seats, or actually 6 seats, that they had not previously won in the cycle, which flipped the chamber to a Democratic majority. Republicans did better in this election than expected. They had some candidates who were able to hold on in Democratic-friendly districts, but it's unclear whether they can continue that next time and kind of reverse some of these gains. Finally, the Senate election was a little bit closer. They had a 1-seat majority, and Democrats flipped 2 seats, one of them based in Loudoun County. This district kind of stretched through the more conservative western portion of the county, and they lost it. And then finally, they lost a seat in the Richmond area. Republicans will complain about this map fairly frequently. Specifically, these couple of districts out in the west look particularly unusual, some would say, but ultimately the map as a whole was skewed towards the Republicans in a lot of ways, and that's why they were able to hold the Senate and the House for quite a while, even with some of the changes in redistricting. So one other thing to go over is a recent political controversy, which kind of shows how Virginia isn't quite a liberal stronghold yet. It's quite Democratic overall. It has a pretty stable lead, similar to places like Colorado or New Mexico, but it's not quite firmly liberal like, say, neighboring Maryland. One example of this is the Second Amendment sanctuary issues. So after reclaiming the legislature, Democrats passed some new gun control laws. These laws weren't quite as extreme as in some other states, but Virginia still has a lot of gun owners and a lot of gun ownership support. And so there was a large controversy around this. You'll notice here that most of the counties overall have supported this. In fact, the majority of the population of Virginia lives in what are sanctuary counties for gun policy. So places like Prince William, of course, are very Democratic now. Even places like Prince Edward, Brunswick, Greensville, and Sussex, African-American counties, Surrey and Suffolk as well, along with Northampton, all passed this. Lots of rural counties overall, even places like Henrico County, which is a Democratic county, voted for constitutional carry, or not constitution, for constitutional policy, which is they would only enforce laws they deem constitutional. At the same time, a couple of other scattering of cities that voted for Donald Trump have voted against it. For example, Lynchburg, Virginia, home of the Liberty University, is a Republican city overall, but its legislature has not passed the sanctuary policies. There's a few other ones as well scattered throughout the state. So this is just one example of a policy where Democrats may have kind of overstepped their initial bounds, but for the time being, there doesn't seem to be any particular backlash aside from these legislative assignments at the county level or the city level where they've just decided they don't like the law and won't enforce it. So I'm going to throw it to Nick now, who's going to kind of explain why the state is trending so far to the Democratic Party. What's making areas like Northern Virginia, Richmond, and Virginia Beach, the Hampton Roads area, start trending more to the Democratic Party as of late?
So as Eric and Jared both mentioned, there is very much a huge change in the Northern Virginia area, and that is around the DC suburb. This is very similar to suburban growth in other areas of the country. If you look at the geographic aspect of each of the elections, you'll see there's very much a divide between two parts of the state, and those are the Northern Virginia area and the Southwestern Virginia area. Back in the 2000s and before that, Southwestern Virginia was actually a very Democratic area. It was one of the most Democratic areas in the state. Like even before that point, it is very much coal country, very working class areas. It had a Democratic representative up to 2010, Rick Boucher. He was only one of 3 Democratic representatives for most of the decade. Now you very much see that this area is actually one of the most Republican in the state. It voted for Trump with very high margins. Like it gave him around 70 to 80% of the vote. So this is very much contrary to the rest of the state, specifically Northern Virginia. This is shown essentially the opposite. And it is definitely the anchor of the state. And it is what makes the state a Democratic state today. In the maps earlier, you saw that you had huge Democratic shifts in some of these areas for a long time. It's hard to deny that this is a Democratic trending areas. And similar to other Democratic trending areas in the country, it is growing very rapidly. And this is very much exemplified by Loudoun County. Now, Loudoun County has had some of the biggest population shifts in the whole country. It actually doubled in population from 1990 to 2000. And it almost doubled again in between 2000 and 2010, and it's still growing very rapidly. It used to be exurbs. It used to be very much rural, very much within the DC sphere of influence, but not very built up. Now that's all changed. It's very much a suburban county. It's got around 400,000 people. So it's one of the biggest areas of influence in the state, and it also fits in with the whole trend of Northern Virginia. And then apart from these two areas, there's the rest of the state is essentially in two areas. There's the rural areas in the center of the state. They have very much Republican leaning, but they also don't have particularly high population, so they don't have much of an influence in the state as a whole. And then apart from that, you got the Richmond, Virginia area, also probably one of the other big suburban areas in the country. And then you got the Hampton Roads. Now, these two areas are similar in a few ways. One of which is that they have very high African American populations. So as a result, they're one of the most reliably Democratic areas of the state. Areas like Norfolk, Portsmouth, and Hampton, and of course Richmond, which is very heavily Black and very heavily Democratic. Unlike Northern Virginia, these areas aren't showing particularly large growth. The growth there, in fact, is pretty steady. relative to the rest of the state and really to the rest of the nation. But you've still got some good signs for Democrats there. For instance, in 2017 and 2018, Democrats did very well around the Virginia Beach area. This is actually the biggest city in the state, like mostly because of its area. It's pretty much defined by a very generic city boundary. So it's definitely not a big suburban area, but it is an important part of the state, and it could be a bellwether to the state. Donald Trump won it in 2016, but there is a very high possibility that it will flip to Democrats in 2020.
So now that we got the regions out of the way, it's the last area to kind of go over with Virginia are the congressional districts. So Virginia, like a lot of states, has had several redistricting maps this cycle. This is the first map drawn by the Republican legislature. This is the map that was in effect for 2012 and 2014. So you'll notice a few things here. Obviously, this map was drawn to be a Republican-favored map, but it goes even a little bit further. So this district right up here, the 10th, stretches into the more Republican-leaning areas of Fairfax County, Loudoun, and Prince William, and was designed to keep the incumbent Republicans in check and to give Republicans an opportunity there. The 4th district right here was Republican-leaning, despite having a lot of the Black Belt areas within it. And this became a source of debate and was one of the reasons the map was ultimately thrown out. So this map was designed to give Republicans a pretty solid majority of 8-3 in the legislature. And then the map was redrawn after a court ruling. So you'll notice here the 4th absorbed most of Richmond and Henrico County, and this made it a Democratic-leaning district. Racially, it's kind of the RA seat, but not really. The majority of the population is white, but similar to North Carolina's 1st congressional district, the black population is sufficient where it can be where you can draw a Democratic-leaning district from it. And so it's very similar to that in that regard, except a little bit more Democratic. And so Republicans were able to maintain their majority with this map, but it was reduced. So 2016, you'll notice they lost a seat, went from an 8-3 map to a 7-4. This is because they lost the 4th district, which they had no chance of winning. The incumbent Republican, Randy Forbes, tried to move to the Virginia Beach-based district and primary Republican there, but that primary challenge failed. So even though Republicans lost the House popular vote by a small margin in Virginia, they were able to hold all of the seats, including the 10th district, which voted for Hillary Clinton by a pretty substantial margin. So Republicans were really on defense in 2018 for a lot of reasons. The anemic and horrendous campaign of Corey Stewart, who made his primary issue Confederate flags, really just kind of destroyed Republicans down ballot in the 2018 elections. You'll notice Democrats won the popular vote by a decisive margin here, and they flipped 3 congressional districts. They flipped the 10th, which was a lot of money was spent here, but the result could be seen coming from basically a mile away from pretty early on. They also flipped the 7th district, which is home to Dave Bratt, who is a Republican who unseated Eric Cantor in a primary. If Eric Cantor had been the nominee in 2018, Republicans probably hold the seat. But the trends in Charlottesville, or the trends in Chesterfield County, really just kind of caught up to them here. And then finally, Democrats flipped the 2nd district. They unseated a Republican in Elaine Loria. The Democrat managed to win the seat as well. This was one that had been very close as well. And going forward, Republicans are going to try to reclaim 2 of these seats, but they really kind of abandoned the 10th. It just that was more of a point of pride for Republican consultants who really wanted to hold on to some sort of strength in the DC area, and ultimately it just wasn't meant to be. So Elections Daily has our race ratings for these elections, and we're going to go ahead and explain the reasons why, and then go into some potential maps going forward into the next decade. So as you can see here, the 9th, 6th, and 1st districts we have listed as safe, although the 1st district is a little bit challenging for Republicans at this point. If you'll notice, in the Senate election, they only narrowly won this district by around 4,000 votes. While they held the seat fairly decisively at the presidential and gubernatorial races, Corey Stewart was such a disastrous candidate that it really hurt them a lot in that district. Because as you can see here, it takes in a lot of Prince William County. We have the 2nd and 7th districts as leans Democratic at the moment. Republicans have decent nominees in the 2nd, 7th district, and Nick Freitas, who's a state representative who nearly won a primary to defeat Corey Stewart for the Republican nomination, is seen as a better candidate than someone like Dave Bratt, but the lean of the district at this point is a little bit challenging. You'll notice here that Tim Kaine won the district by around 5 percentage points, and it only narrowly voted for Ed Gillespie in 2017, and it voted for Trump by around 6 percentage points. Again, another challenging district for Republicans. The second, as you can see here, really had a sharp trend. Donald Trump won it by around 3 percentage points, but Democrats won it in both the gubernatorial and Senate races. The gubernatorial election can kind of be explained because Ralph Northam was a state senator from this area, so he was kind of well known there. But Republicans, this is probably of the three, it's probably the most challenging for them to claim back, especially because Elaine Lurie is not quite as has the same security background as the incumbent of the 7th district at this point, Abigail Spanberger. Finally, here you'll notice the 5th district, which is a bit unusual here. So why is the 5th competitive? Well, the 5th was competitive in 2018, but both candidates were considered to be relatively subpar. Denver Riggleman, the Republican nominee, had gotten in hot water for being a little bit too libertarian and also for having published Bigfoot erotica in the past. And no, I'm not making that up. He actually wrote these novels and got him in trouble. But on the Democratic side, the Democratic nominee wasn't really that strong either. She had faced some challenges for a book she had written about which has some supposed anti-Semitic influences in it. And also the district is still very Republican. If you'll notice, it voted for Corey Stewart by around 2 percentage points, voted for Trump by over 10, and voted for Ed Gillespie by 8 percentage points. So this shouldn't be a district that's competitive. Why is it competitive? Well, Republicans decided to hold a convention to renomination of this district. And Denver Riggleman lost. And what was basically, our writer Joe Szymanski has written a lot about this race. He had gotten into hot water for officiating a gay wedding. And this really irritated some social conservatives in the district. Bob Good, a former athletic director at Liberty University, which is within the district, ran a campaign against him primarily as a social conservative, someone who would not be supportive of stuff like that. And he managed to win the convention. How did he do this? Well, he raised a small amount of money and spent basically all of it into bribing the delegates to vote for him. The convention was also held in a drive-through at his own church, which really gives you an idea of how kind of stacked the odds were stacked against Denver Riggleman here. And so obviously Bob Good, as a very far-right Republican, would be probably the most conservative member of the delegation if he were elected. And with a stronger nominee, Democrats would probably have had a better shot at the seat. But their nominee, Cameron Webb, is also very progressive. So in a seat that's almost certainly going to vote for Donald Trump by some margin, it's more challenging to see Webb winning here, given his progressive credentials, even though Bob Good isn't remotely close to a really strong nominee here. So these are the districts as they stand at the moment. They're going to be redrawn in 2022 by the new legislature that's elected in 2021. Republicans are hoping to win back the legislature, but ultimately, most likely the maps will be drawn by an independent commission. This is going before the voters, and some Democrats are not supportive of this measure because they're concerned the Virginia Supreme Court, which is controlled by Republicans, would skew the maps, although this didn't really happen in places like Pennsylvania. So if the measure is passed by voters, there will be a commission to draw the maps instead of the legislature drawing them. But assuming the voters reject this amendment, the map can be redrawn by the legislature in whatever way they please. And so I'm going to throw it to Jared, who will explain 2 map possibilities, a nonpartisan map and a Republican gerrymander. And then Nick will show a similar nonpartisan map and a Democratic gerrymander.
Yeah, so as Eric mentioned, I'm going to show you 2 possibilities that I think could really be explained as either a fair map drawn potentially by a commission or a very strong Republican gerrymandering if Republicans are able to win back the state legislature in 2021, which we'll have to see about. First, I just want to go to the fair map. So the fair map, it shows a few distinct regional trends. You can see that the 9th district right over here, the 6th district, which both basically line up with the western portions of the state, very, very rural. These are going to be strongly Republican seats. They're safe. They're in no danger of flipping at all. And this is how they are today. The 1st district, usually also a safely Republican seat, it went for Donald Trump by a pretty hefty margin. But here, it's really being consolidated as an even more Republican seat than it is today, just because, as Eric mentioned, Corey Stewart almost lost his district in his 2018 senatorial bid. And so you can see here that this district was won by around 9%, even in the 2018 senatorial bid. So it's safely Republican district nevertheless. It's really the one final remnant of Republican support in Northern Virginia. That's how it's seen today, and that's how it's probably going to be. And that is because you have three districts that take in the pretty strongly Democratic area that is Northern Virginia. First of all, you have the 8th district, which takes in Alexandria and Arlington, and the very immediate Washington suburbs. It takes in cities like McLean, which actually are historically Republican. They were part of the former 10th district with the little tendril sticking out, but they are now solidly Democratic. You have the 11th district, which takes in some of the more outlying areas, but still strongly suburban. It's still pretty compact and still voting strongly Democratic in every race possible. There's no danger of flipping. Finally, the 10th district has been very much consolidated, moved to encompass Prince William County. I can show you right here, as well as Southeastern Loudoun County, which is the most Democratic region of Loudoun County. It's also the one that's growing the fastest, as well as just a small bit of Fairfax County. Strongly Democratic district, safely so that in a Republican wave year, it's not going to flip. So you can see this district, the 10th district right over here, which encompasses Prince William County and some of the independent cities, a bit of Fairfax County, and then going in to Southeastern Loudoun County, which is actually culturally distinct from the rest of Loudoun County in that it is the most quickly growing region of Loudoun County, with places like Sterling and Reston. And so this is, again, very distinct from the other parts of Loudoun County, as you can see right over here, which are generally more rural in nature. In fact, there have been some ideas of this part of the county seceding from this other part of the county, which is, again, pushing the county very quickly to the left. And so that's been something that's of note. To go over some other districts, you have the 5th district, which is Denver Riggleman's district, but soon to be probably Bob Good's district. Takes in Charlottesville as it does today, but the rural areas very much overwhelm the rest of the district and make it Republican leaning. The red district is really meant to be the Richmond district with Henrico County, a very safely Democratic district, which is not going to flip really by any means. The 7th district, however, which is the Brown district, taking in Chesterfield County and some of the more exurban and rural counties around Richmond. You can see there is a small part of it that juts into some of the more immediate suburbs with Henrico County. And this district is going to be generally Republican. It voted for Donald Trump in 2016. However, it also voted against the Republican in the 2018 senatorial race. And so if Donald Trump really hemorrhages throughout the state, if he loses by over double digits, over 15%, this could be a district that does flip. That's something that's quite interesting. Okay, so going down to the southeastern portion of the state with Norfolk and some of the Hampton Roads, very Democratic areas are basically encapsulated within this purple district. Currently, Bobby Scott takes in pretty similar areas in the current congressional layout. And then the Virginia Beach district is going to be pretty competitive. However, considering current circumstances, it's going to be somewhat Democratic leaning, just considering Biden's strength and also the gains of Democrats throughout the state in recent years. Finally, go to a Dem PAC or Republican gerrymander that is quite extreme, to be honest. Just because there is so much Democratic growth in the state, it's really inconceivable for Republicans to try to get a gerrymander out of a 7-4 map. Having 4 Democratic districts solely, this does not take in a substantial amount of Democratic territory to render the rest of the Republican territory safely Republican. And because the Nova district because the Nova region is growing so much, you're just going to have to probably add a 3rd district to really take in those strong Democratic areas of Nova to ensure that the other districts are safely Republican. And so if you have essentially 3 districts up in Nova, a Richmond district, and then some of the Hampton Roads / Newport, that's going to be pretty much sufficient to render the rest of the state Republican enough to draw safely Republican districts in pretty much every other part of the state, even as the small college towns like Blacksburg and Charlottesville are still Democratic leaning.
Okay, so there are several different ways to draw a fair map in Virginia, and this is one of them. This is one that I drew about a year ago. I went for a few different things here. First of all, a lot of the districts are very compact. A lot of them are actually a huge departure from what you see in the current map. As you can see in Northern Virginia, there are several different ways to draw this, but what I did was went for the compactness method. So the 8th district is very, very much those immediate suburbs of Washington, D.C. Very democratic. Some of the biggest swings towards Democrats between 2012 and 2016 in the whole country. In fact, the 11th district was mostly drawn to keep it essentially a majority minority district. I believe the current 11th does follow those rules. It's about 49% Democratic, and the rest of the minorities are pretty evenly spread. There's a lot of Hispanics, a lot of African Americans, and a lot of actually Asian Americans in the district. And I went for the same sort of thing with the 11th. Geographically, it's not very similar, but demographically, it is. Now, the 10th district that they currently use is drawn as a Republican gerrymander, but they're not likely to carry that on this year. The first reason is because it has swung to the left significantly since then. Hillary Clinton actually won it by 10 points, and also because, as I mentioned earlier, the area is rapidly growing. So this one takes in some of Fairfax County and some of Loudoun County, and it turns into a heavily Democratic district. Hillary Clinton actually won this one by about 35 points. Then going away from that, you can actually see that 5th district here. This doesn't actually have much overlap with the current 5th district. It's actually about 15% overlap. I only drew it because that sort of fit in with the numbering system, but I wouldn't expect whoever the incumbent of the 5th district is to run in 2022. I expect it to be a completely open seat. Going south of that, you might actually have some conflicts with the 6th district. This is because incumbents Ben Klein of the current 6th district, Morgan Griffith of the current 9th, and if he wins, Bob Good would live in this district. So if they all decide to run, this will probably be their best bet. Griffith could probably run in the new 9th, but Good and Klein would probably be pitted against each other. And then you've got the 7th district. This is, as of now, a Democratic district. It's a Romney-Trump district. This district encompasses many of these suburban areas near Richmond, particularly those western suburbs that Abigail Spanberger now represents. But it also encompasses Charlottesville, one of the most democratic cities in the state. This is a Democratic stronghold, mostly because it's a college town, and this is essentially what makes it a Democratic district, as opposed to the current district, which is, even though it's represented by a Democrat, is still very much a Republican-leaning district. This one would definitely be more safe for Spanberger as the decade goes on. And then as you approach those like Hampton Road areas, they are largely similar to the current districts. That second is actually a little bit more Republican. Elaine Luria, the incumbent, might not be able to hold it in a good year, but she still have a good chance. I believe it's a Trump plus 6 district. The 4th district in my map is actually the RA district. It's majority black by some standards. It would be almost certain to elect Don McEachin, the current incumbent. And that really only leaves the 3rd and the 1st. The 3rd is another VRA district, and the 1st is not very much changed from the current 1st, except that you got Prince William County drawn out of it. Okay, now going on to the next map that I have. This isn't actually my map. This was made by Twitter user Nathan Jordan. It was drawn as a 9-2 Democratic gerrymander. Now this, in my opinion, is very ambitious, but it could hold as a successful Democratic gerrymander throughout the decade. Now, as I mentioned, 9 of these districts are Democratic leaning. Many of them heavily so. Not all of those 9 actually went for Trump. Not all of those 9 districts actually went to Clinton. I believe the 2nd and the 6th of these districts went to Trump, but they are in essence drawn to protect the Democratic incumbents. Well, in the case of the 2nd district, the Democratic incumbent, but in the 6th district, if Cameron Webb wins that, this would very much be to protect him. In Northern Virginia, you actually have 4 districts instead of 3 for Democrats. You have those 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th districts. And then the other one that stands out is the 1st district. Now, this would actually have the home of Abigail Spanberger in in the 7th district. And even though this doesn't overlap with her current district, it would still be pretty safe for her, assuming she gets through the primary. But if everything goes right for Democrats, this could be a very successful gerrymander. And the reason I put this on is because Democrats now have a trifecta in the Virginia government, which means they have the legislature, both chambers of the legislature, and the governorship. So in theory, they could push through a gerrymander of their own. It's not necessarily guaranteed that this will be the case. Ralph Northam, in his campaign in 2017, said that he would only pass a map if he thought it was fair by partisan standards. But it is unclear whether he'll keep that promise. If they do gerrymander it, that is not guaranteed that they will draw one as brutal as this one, as unfavorable for Republicans as this one does. But it really is anyone's guess at this point. I put this up as an example of what they would draw.
So that kind of gives you the idea of the possibilities of the districts. Obviously, districts may be drawn in different ways depending on who controls the legislature, how the commission goes, but we'll definitely be looking for that going into 2022. So with that, we're going to close up this week's edition of the Map Room. Thank you for watching. Where can we find you guys on social media, Jared and Nick?
You can find me on Twitter. My Twitter account is @JSnowPolitics.
You can find me on Twitter. My handle is TossUpReport.
And you can find me on Twitter @DECunningham2. And you can find our writings at Elections Daily. That's @elections_daily on Twitter and elections-daily.com. We also do other shows. We have other podcasts and all sorts of things, so be sure to check that out. So yeah, thank you for watching, and we'll see you on next week's edition of the Map Room.